Hope you really enjoyed being in Iași today. For the last session of the conference, it is my pleasure to give the talk to Michela Giorcelli, who is an associate professor at UCLA. She's interested in economic history, productivity, the diffusion, long-term diffusion of soft technologies. So I took a paper for this. Usually I wouldn't need a paper, but she has a lot of affiliations and fellowships and prizes. I'll still miss a few probably. She's an associate at NBER, ISA, JPAL, CCPR. She has multiple papers in top journals, fellowships, and prizes, especially in economic history. I got to meet Michela last year when she was visiting at Stanford, so I know that there's a lot of good economists and economists who are publishing in top journals, but it's relatively rarer to have someone who is also a good teacher and a good person to explain difficult topics. So it is my pleasure to give the floor to Michela. Thank you.
Hi everyone. First of all, I would like to thank Miai for the very generous introduction and the organizers for inviting me. The conference has been great, and it was a true pleasure to be here in Iași. So today we are talking about professional productivity, the diffusion of soft technologies during under World War II, which is at the core of my research, and I'm currently working on a book based on a couple of papers that I wrote that tries to understand how soft technologies diffused during World War II in the US, how they were exported to the rest of the world in the aftermath of World War II, and what were the implications for productivity. But before digging into the historical setting, I would like to start by thinking about the European productivity in the last 20 years and why we do care so much about productivity, and studying productivity is important. So here we have three time series about the 27 European countries in the last 20 years, the 20 countries who have Euro and Romania. And we can see that while Romania has witnesses a pretty impressive increase in productivity, here we are talking about productivity in terms of labor productivity. The rest of Europe has a stagnating productivity. If you take 2010, 20, which is year's reference year, we can see that productivity has not increased. There is a slightly decrease in productivity, like this slowdown in productivity seems to be a big issue for European countries. And this was reflected in the 2024 Draghi report that was released last September. And the main takeaway of this report was that it's now time for Europe to put into an action, in the sense that European productivity is lagging behind US and China. And we discussed during the talk that this was one of the leading motives of the fact that the productivity of European firms was lagging behind the US, that pushed the US to sponsor the diffusion of managerial practices after World War II to Europe. So it looks like history is repeating itself in a way, and the report also encouraged European countries to undertake a bunch of reform to boost productivity and innovation through investment in terms of energy industrial policy, and also in terms of strengthen the relationship with the US and with the recent tariff debate. I'm not sure how much this is going to happen, but this is not the focus of the talk today. We were mostly thinking about how we can improve productivity and innovation. But why do we care about productivity so much? Why productivity is so important in the economic debate? First of all, productivity is arguably the most important determinant of living standards. We can think about productivity as the amount of output that a firm is able to produce given a set of inputs, or we can also think about labor productivity in terms of output per worker or revenues per worker. So both measure of productivity, both definition of productivity help explaining a large variation in the GDP per capita across countries. countries, and we can see that the spread in productivity really resembles the spread in GDP per capita among countries. And some studies have shown that roughly 30% of the differences in living standards across countries can trace back to productivity differences. Of course, we can think that there are many reasons of these productivity differences across different countries in the world. So more recently, some studies start investigating difference in productivity within countries and within sector in a given country. And the results seems to confirm the existence of this huge spread in productivity. If we focus on total factor productivity, so the amount of output that a firm could produce, given a set of inputs, meaning that we are controlling for differences, for instance, in technology or quality of the labor force, even in very well-defined industries like concrete, the most productive establishment in the US is producing twice as much output as the least productive using the same set of input, the same technology, comparable labor force. These spreads are even larger in developing countries. In India and China, they are 5-to-1. So like the most productive establishment is 5 times more productive as the least productive establishment. And if you look at the differences in the distribution of productivity at the firm level between, for instance, US and China, it looks like that most differences coming from the left tail. So like in developing countries, there are many more unproductive firms or less productive firms than in the US, for instance. And the other reason why it's important to think about productivity is that productivity differences are strongly correlated over time. There is a correlation coefficient of 0.8, meaning that this productivity spread could be very persistent over time within the same set of firms. The next question is what determines this productivity spread and why they are so persistent. So most of the literature up to 15 years ago has focused on differences in our technologies, innovation, patents, information and communication technologies, while roughly 15 years ago, a new explanation has brought forward, which is management, or soft technologies, which is the focus of the talk today, in particular the effects that management can have on productivity. So first of all, what is management? So we can use 2 different definitions of management. So first of all, we can think about practices, like specific practices that a firm put in place and that are used to organize production, dealing with labor force, coordinating input and output distribution. On the other one, we can also think about managers that are either the CEO or the other managerial talent that firm acquire, and they are responsible for putting in place these practices. And we can think about a managerial capital distinct from the human capital that in a way enter the production function of the firm. How can we think about the effects of management on productivity? Well, we can think management as a technology in the sense that it raises the productivity of the other inputs. So if we're thinking about a production function, we can incorporate management in the A in front of the production function. And so if the level of management, if the quality of a management that a firm or a country has, then also labor is more productive and capital is more productive. And how does it come? Well, good managers could identify better workers and hire them. They could be better in retaining the most productive workers. They can identify the most promising investment projects, and so these could help firms to maintain high productivity. We can also think about efficiency. in the sense that good managers could be better in allocating the scarce resources that firms have. An example of this could be assigning the employees to the most suitable task for their skills, for instance. And this also spills into the discussion of human capital in the sense that, of course, when we're talking about resources, management of human capital specifically is one of the most important components that can affect productivity. There has been a few papers showing that better managers could improve the productivity of their labor through the labor force, through a better allocation of existing resources. And interestingly, this is something that is happening both in the private and in the public sector. So what we're going to talk about today is start with an overview of the concept of management, how it developed with the Industrial Revolution, and to what extent the war effort in the context of World War II helped defining managerial practices who persisted up to today. And then I will review two of my works, one that speaks about the large-scale interventions and of management and their effect on productivity, and the second one that is more about the long-term effect of management transfer. So to what extent management practices could be transferred across countries, and to what extent they affect productivity of receiving firms. And then we can have some conclusive remarks that hopefully can give some insights about the discussion after the presentation about what we can learn from the historical context for today's productivity debate. Okay, so to get started with the historical development of management, before the Industrial Revolution, so before the 18th century, mid-18th century, the context of management as we intend today did not exist, in the sense that a firm, or maybe we should call them businesses, were very small. They didn't have much organizational problems. Usually the owner was working side by side with the employees, and so he can monitor and adjust the operation quite easily. The problem of management in the sense of coordination of resources within the firm started emerging in mid-19th century, in particular during the Second Industrial Revolution in the US with the rise of big businesses. In this case, if you're thinking about, for instance, the railroad construction or the telegraph construction, it was necessary to connect units working in different parts of the countries, and therefore a managerial hierarchy that could coordinate these different inputs became particularly important. The Second Industrial Revolution also somehow changed what were the leading figures in firms, in the sense that during the First Industrial Revolution, so the one that took place in the UK, mostly driven by the textile sector, the most important figure was the entrepreneur who was able to think outside the box in a way, coming up with new production methods, new production ideas. While during the Second Industrial Revolution, managers who think within the box, in the sense of solving this coordination problem, became more important. So we can think in a way that like thinking inside the box goes back to the idea of efficiency. So like to having a better allocation of existing resources within the firm. Over time, particularly towards the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, more and more management and organizational theories developed. We can think about Taylorism, for instance, that was mostly focused on increasing labor productivity, or Gilbert, that in a similar vein started analyzing the motion of the workers, trying to understand where it was possible to cut unnecessary moves that could have improved labor productivity. And probably the most notable example of implementation of managerial practices to the extent they were known at the time, is represented by the Ford factory that had the idea of reducing the movement of the workers by having them stand and having the different parts of cars coming to the workers. This allows a significant drop in the time necessary to assemble a car from 12 hours to just 2.5 hours, meaning that the mass production of the 40 that was in production for more than 30 years could start. So here we're talking about the beginning of the 20th century. There were two major turning points in the development of managerial practices that correspond to the two world wars. So during World War I, especially in the US, there was a substantial increase in shipbuilding, and there was the development of a training method mostly based on learning by doing that had the idea of trained worker to train almost 500,000 workers, reducing the time to launch new vessels. Despite there was this increase in productivity, given that US entered the World War I pretty late, and most of these changes happened in the shipbuilding industry, there were limited spillovers to other industries. There was a debate about productivity that was pretty intense during the 20s and the 30s in the attempt to reach the optimal productivity. There were also pretty innovative methods in order to measure productivity. So, for instance, the Hawthorne experiments that were run between 1924 and 1933 try to test the effectiveness of changing some mostly labor practices by implementing this change in some factories and not in others. So we can think about a very simple randomized control trial where there was not a proper randomization, but the idea was having a treatment and control group. That was pretty impressive for the time. And the results of these experiments were mixed in the sense that the overall conclusion was that better management could increase productivity, but also the so-called Hawthorne effect was identified. Sometimes workers' productivity increased when a change was announced, even if the change was not implemented. And this goes back to this idea that workers also respond to psychological incentives, and so understanding their intrinsic motivation could have important effect in terms of productivity. The major turning point in the history of management goes back to World War II, when the US started experience a surge in demand for war products, but not only war products, that goes back to 1939. So these orders were exceeding US productive capacity, and of course, even if the US entered the war in December 1941, there was this increasing concern that when the US would have entered the war, then men in the working age would have to serve, and the demand was set to increase even more. So there was a widespread consensus that the production and productivity of US firms should have increased. So in this setting, the training within industry program was developed and sponsored. It was a management training program offered to US war contractors, so very large firms that were receiving war orders from the government. That was in place between August 1930 and September 1945, with the idea of assisting defense industry by training within the industry each worker to make the best use of their skills. So in this quote from the Labor Division report in 1940, we can see what were the key principle of these methods, which was training the leaders, which in turn would have to train the workers in order to reach the maximum productivity. So we have this idea of the optimal productivity and how to reach optimal productivity that is coming back in the debate. The content of the training within industry was based on teaching three models, and the reason why I think this is important, on top of the content of the program, better understanding the content of the program, is to draw a comparison between what good management at the time was considered versus what good management today is considered, and we can see that most of the good management principles have survived up to today. So, for instance, one of the three models was called job instruction. The idea was to improve factory operation by giving the supervisor the possibility of break into the task to men and jobs. So this led, for instance, to the establishment of standard procedures, improved lighting, implementing job safety, implementing regular maintenance of machine, recording reason to breakdowns so that it was easier to fix a problem if it's there more than once. And these are considered still today good practices in terms of factory operation. On the other hand, we have job relation, which is human resources management. We already discussed how important it is, and in particular, the idea was that firms had to train their own workers in order to increase the productivity and also predict and suggest the introduction of performance-based incentive systems, so mostly bonus for both workers and managers themselves. And finally, job methods that had the goal of simplifying, improving methods of doing jobs, for instance, through a better management inventory, better prioritization of workers, more emphasis on marketing. And here I would like to underscore how inventory management, production planning, prioritization of orders were the foundation of the Toyota Lean production. I will go back to this towards the end of the presentation, but definitely the export of managerial principle after World War II can be seen also as a continuity with what happened and what Japanese, in particular car factories, but in general Japanese firms developed in the aftermath of World War II. Okay, so this program was open, as I said, to all the US work contractors, so firms that were working for the government. Perhaps surprisingly, the application rate was roughly 50%. So among firms that were eligible, roughly half apply and roughly half did not apply, as we can see from the slides. The U.S. work contractor the location of the U.S. work contractor closely follow the location of industrial production in the U.S. back then, so mostly was concentrated in the Northeast, Midwest, some on the West Coast, not much, and then an important part of the industrial policy of the U.S. during World War II was the industrialization of the South, and so also some of them were in the South. Okay, so we saw that firms that could apply to this program were U.S. work contractors. So we're talking about very large firms that were working for the government. So probably they were already the best firm in the U.S. Scenario. So how were these firms look like? They were huge. On average, they have 1,000 of employees, 6 plants. Most of them were in manufacturing, but some were also in transportation, services, and agriculture, which seems to suggest that good management practices have some application also beyond the manufacturing sector, and they were huge in terms of sales and assets. However, if we turn in terms of productivity and in general efficiency, we can see that these firms were not doing that great. Productivity was pretty low. Profitability, return on assets, was only 3%. Inventory was massive relative to the current asset, like 80% of current asset was inventory, so massive inventory, and most of these firms have suffered severe issues due to the war. For instance, on average 20% of the workers were drafted and more than 50% has to switch production in order to fulfill the government orders and more in general the war needs. How was the program implemented? So it was extremely highly standardized. The idea of this program in general, most of the programs that were implemented by the US during and after World War II was standardization. Ideally, what they wanted was to offer the exact same thing to all the firms in the country. And also quality control was very important, so there was a pretty frequent audits of the program. And historical account of the time report a great success. Manufacturing companies were arguing that there was a decrease of 50% of the defective product. Steel companies reported a drop in complaint by their workers. It looks like that the labor relations had improved, and also in general, wrapping operation required less man hours after one specific training. So, of course, these were reports made by the companies. We can think that maybe they were under the control of the government, so they have incentives of over-reporting. But at least from anecdotal evidence, it looks like that the program was pretty successful at the time. Okay, narrowing a little bit more to identification, empirical strategy, what happened during the implementation of the program. So first of all, there was not, so while there was a consensus that production and productivity of US firms should increase, there was some debate about whether investing of management was the best way of increasing productivity back then. So there were limited resources that were allocated to the program on the one hand. On the other hand, there was lack of instructors, so like people that could teach these methods. So some were trained, but they were people already working in the industry that already had other occupations, and so they could only, some of them could only be hired part-time. So what happened was that most of these people specialized in teaching just one model and just in some geographical areas of the US that were called sub-districts back then, meaning that while the idea of the program was very ambitious, the implementation was less successful. So we can see that given the fact that there was not enough instructors that could train in this program, only 52% of firms that apply end up being treated, so receiving any treatment during this period. So we started with the pool of applicants, roughly half applied to the program, and roughly half eventually got something. So definitely much smaller scale than what expected. And among those, so 48% didn't get anything. Among the 52% that got something, there was a different combination of training that firms received. Some, only 7%, got training in all the models. Some received training only in 2 models, and the other one only in 1 model. And I think this is an interesting feature of the program, because on top of studying the effect of management on firm performance, it's also possible to study the effect of specific practices of firm performance. While in modern settings, usually management is a bundle of practices, so there is a training in all these practices. It's very hard to know which one is the most effective in terms of increasing firm performance. Okay, so I don't want to be too technical here, but just very briefly, what we're doing in the paper is using a study diff and diff. So what we have is output of a given firm in a given year, and by output I mean sales, productivity, profitability, and some indicators of implementation of managerial practices, and we regress it on an indicator for firms that were trained, dummy for each year after the implementation of the program, and we control for a bunch of fixed effects, in particular when firms apply for the program. So we can think that firms that apply at the big, so the program lasted 5 years, so we can think that firms that apply very early were more likely to receive any of the training, or maybe all of them. In I will briefly discuss that it was not the case because of this inefficient and limited scale of the program. And then finally, of course, we control for country, state, and country, sector, and time fixed effect, just to control for the fact that some industries or some counties could grow more due to the work, but not due to the implementation of this program. Okay, so what happened to the performance of these firms? Overall, the results were pretty large and sizable. Focusing on sales, we can see that firms that received and did not receive the training appear comparable in the 5 years before the implementation of the program. Then sales start increasing. They reach a maximum increase of 22%. 8 years after the start of the program, and then a cumulative 16% increase at the end of the period. Of course, we can think that if these firms were contractor, they were receiving the training, the increase in sales is just the effect of the war. So here we have two lines. One is when the program started, and one is 3 years after that. And since the program was implemented between 1940 and 1945, but most firms were trained between 1942 and 1945, roughly 3 years after the start of the program is the end of the war for most firms. And so we can see that, yes, sales increased during the war, but they continue to increase quite a bit even after the end of the war. So it's unlikely that the effect is entirely driven by the war per se. We can also see what happened to productivity. The results in productivity are even more striking. Firms were very similar. There was not a lot of variance in terms of productivity before the war, but then the effects start increasing and productivity rise by 36%. At the end of the 10 years, we were able to follow the firms. And finally, return on assets, so a measure of profitability. In a way, again, not a lot of differences before the start of the war, then an increase and 11% higher productivity of firms that received training relative to firms that did not get any training. Okay, so overall, these results seems to indicate that the implementation of good managerial practices can have a pretty large and persistent effect on firm performance. But why this is the case? So on the one end, we can think that the effect is really driven by management. Firms are getting better to do their jobs thanks to the implementation of managerial practices. This is why productivity increased. We can also think that these firms simply got better relation with the government. They were trained during the war to be more productive, so after they got trained, maybe they get special treatment or simply more orders, more collaboration with the government. This could also have increased their productivity. We can think about management versus managers. Maybe these firms were very similar, but those who ended up being trained also have better managers. So this is the fact of managers more than management. Or we can think about a better relationship within the supply chain. So in terms of the implementation of managerial practices, what I think we can do, and it's interesting in my view in this context, is that we can relate change in managerial practices at the firm level with the specific type of training that firms received. So for instance, here we can see that the job instruction model, the one that could have improved the firm factory operation, like firm operation in terms of production, And here we can look at the recording worker injuries. Here the level of the data is pretty good because during the war, of course, worker injuries, workers were scarce resources, a lot of men were serving, so of course precisely recording the causes of delayed production was important. So the government was keeping a very good track. They were serving work contractors almost every month in order to see what was the situation on the ground. That's how we could get this data. So worker injuries did not show a lot of differences between firms who were treated across the 3 different models before the war. But then it decreased only for firms, or mostly for firms, that got the job training. So in a way, the job instruction method led to better operations. We can look at what happened to firms that got training in the job relations, so human resources management. We can see that there was a pretty strike and persistent jumps in number of strikes, which could be indicative of better relation of with the workforce. And again, the workers of the other firms seems to be less happy. If anything, there is a slight increase relative to the years before. And finally, we can see what happened to firms that adopted job methods, so better procedure for production. We can see that there is a substantial decrease, almost a 15% decrease in the inventory. That was one of the causes of inefficiency for these firms. So, going back to the first question, was this increase in productivity really driven by the implementation of managerial practices? It seems that these managerial practices firms were taught were implemented, and we can see both an increase in productivity and improvement of the practices that should respond to the training that firms received. Then the second question is about relation with the government. So we can think if firms, after receiving the training, got better relation with the government, for instance, more contracts, higher number of contracts, and it doesn't seem to be the case. And interestingly, even after the war, they did not receive a special treatment in terms of post-war funds that the government was giving to firms in order to go back to the civilian production after the war disruption. So it doesn't look like they were getting specific or preferential treatment from the government. The third question was an effect of management, of managers. So we can also turn it to be what happened when we train some managers and then they leave the firm. Do they bring all the new knowledge with them or no? So here we can look at the effects, for instance, on sales based on the number of managers that left the firm in the 10 years after the war. Managers who left the firm during the war were extremely limited, so we can think that most of this effect is coming from the post-war period. And we can see that, yes, if most managers stay, the effects are larger, but the effects remain pretty persistent even when more managers are leaving. So this seems to indicate that when there is this kind of training, there is a sort of managerial human capital, firm-specific, that stays there and that can help firms to continue to improve. And finally, the last thing is if these firms are getting better, are there spillovers to the other firms? So here we're looking at firms that are in the supply chain of firms that got the training, and it looks like this is the case for most treatment, in particular for the job relation, job methods. We have increase in productivity. And we also have an increase in implementation of the practices that firms they are related to were trained. So it looks like that there is an internal knowledge transfer of managerial practices within the supply chain. Okay, so just to sum up what we discussed so far, so what drives the increase in productivity is the implementation of managerial practices. The evidence seems to suggest that this is the case. Is just relation with the government? No, we didn't see any differential improvement in relation with the government. Is managers or managers it is mostly management. Managers matter, but they're not completely driving all the effect. And there is also an improvement in the supply chain. So firms that were in supply chain became more productive, and so we can think that if firms in supply chain are more productive, then there could be also reverse spillovers on firms that were trained that could become even more productive, and so on. Before moving on, can I ask how I'm doing with time? 5-10 minutes left. Okay. So I can skip with to the long-term effect of management transfer, in the sense that once the war ended, the hope of the US was to create a private demand for the TWI services, but this didn't happen, mostly because the US market was already expanding quite a bit. The US were one of the very few countries in the world that could produce and export, and so firms started thinking a little bit less about the importance of productivity. And so what the US did was sponsoring the transfer of managerial practices from the US to Europe first and to Japan then. So the intervention in Europe are under the big umbrella of the Marshall Plan, this plan of economic and financial aid that the US sponsored between 1948 and the 50s. In particular, between 1948 and 1952, the US gave money to Western Europe, and the results were pretty good, in the sense that GDP recovered, industrial production as well. But, and so by 1952, most Western European countries were already at the pre-war level, 1938 level. However, the US Bureau of Statistics observed that there was an increasing productivity gap between US and European businesses, which goes very much in the same direction of last year's European Union report. And in particular, one of these experts argued that the lack of good management in Europe was even more serious problem than the damages caused by the war. So we can decide whether we want to agree or not with the statement, but I think it reflects very well the extent to which the US think about the importance of management. So in this context, what the US did was sponsor G productivity program between 1952 and 1958 with the goal of transferring US managerial practices and technology to Europe. And by doing so, they organized training trip for European managers at US firms. So what I did was mostly focusing on the program in Italy. At the beginning, the project was much more ambitious. The idea was to collecting data for a bunch of European countries, but then there were some technical and language issues, so I decided to only focus on Italy. And what was interesting about the implementation of this program in Italy was that the program was announced in 1950 with the idea of having a pilot phase before a nationwide implementation. Also in this case, among firms that were eligible with given characteristics, 60% applied and 40% did not apply. So this seems a pretty common pattern with what happened in the US. Not all firms that could improve their managerial skills want to do that, and this is something that we still observe today in developing countries, which seems pretty interesting to me. And firms could decide whether they want to send their managers to the US, receive new machine from the US, or both. So initially, firms that were eligible to apply were coming from these 5 regions in Italy. Then there was a budget cut. The US didn't have enough money to fund the program in all these regions, and so they decided to narrow the program to 5 small counties, one for each of the region initially selected, and only firms from these regions ended up receiving the training they applied for. And so here we have the actual number of firms that received the training they asked for. Rejection were very low, only 30%, only 30, so less than 1% of firms eventually got rejected. Okay, so in terms of the specification, once again, what we're looking here is the outcome of a given firm in a given year, regressing it on firm fixed effect, time fixed effect, and an interaction between being treated years after treatment and some error terms. So before digging into the main results and in particular the main outcome, which is of course productivity, it's interesting to see whether it's important to study the long-term effect of management. And here we are looking at the survival rate of firms. So the data, the firm performance data, goes from the year in which firms were trained up to 15 years. These are those who got the training. These are those who didn't get the training. We can see that up to 5 years after the program, there was not a huge difference in survival, like between treatment and control. But if we look at the entire period, like 90% of firms that got trained survived after 15 years versus 68% of firms that didn't get the training. So sometimes studying the long-term effect of program is important because the effect could take time to materialize. And this goes back to what economic history can teach us about some important questions in economics more in general. So focusing on productivity, what we can see here is that, once again, firms that got and didn't get the training look pretty similar before the start of the program. Then there was a steady increase in productivity, 15% increase in the year of the implementation of the program, and a cumulative effect of almost 50% after the end of the program. We can think about these effects being fairly large, but we can also compare them with some modern studies that look at the effect of management, managerial practices, consulting on firm productivity, and see what are the differences in sites. So probably the most famous paper about management intervention is Nick Bloom and Cotter's randomized controlled trial on textile firms in India that estimated 90% increase in sales in the year of intervention. In the paper that I showed before, the effect is almost 4%. And 10% year after 4 years. And if we look at productivity, the effects in Bloom paper are definitely larger. There are not a lot of studies that look at the long-term effect, but at least in the short run, it looks like that the magnitude of effects of productivity is comparable, which once again seems to reinforce the idea that we can learn something useful for the past for current studies. Interestingly, another component of the program was just receiving technology, like new machines, from the US. And in this case, we can see that the effects are much smaller in magnitude and way less persistent. We have only 10% increase, 11% increase after 15 years, but borderline significant. So the effects are smaller in magnitude and less persistent over time. They flatten down at some point. I also would like, before wrapping up, thinking a little bit more about the Japanese case, in the sense, and this is something I'm currently working on. I was hoping to have some results to show, but we are not quite there, in the sense that so most of the implementation of the productivity program was in the early 50s in Europe, starting in the mid 50s, so 1955 up to 1965, the US also exported managerial practices to Japan. And the Japanese case was a little bit different than European cases in many respects. So first of all, not only the TWI principle were exported, but also new techniques about quality components, statistical methods, inventory management, that were combined with local needs. The fact that Japanese firms were very much space constrained, and the idea of the TWI learning by doing was able to solve language barrier between the two countries. The results were pretty striking. The Toyota management system was developed as a consequence of this program, and in particular the just-in-time production, prioritizing order based on the delivery deadline was a core point of the lean production. The interesting part here is that Japanese firms, in particular Japanese car firms, became very more productive than US firms. So they start selling better cars that were also cheaper in the US during the 80s. And at that point, the US firms organized training trip for Japanese managers in the US in order to learn these production techniques that, however, were originated in the US themselves during the war. Most of the principles remain pretty similar over years. So in order to leave some space to Q&A, I think I can draw some conclusive remarks. And in particular, what this presentation shows that management can have a positive and long-lasting effect on firm performance, in particular production and productivity, that creates complementarity with technology, while spillovers overall remain pretty limited. We saw that there were spillovers in the supply chain, not that much in other firms in the production chain. And of course, the most salient question at this point is what can we learn from an historical episode for today's economy? So first of all, most of the TWI principles are still taught today, and we can see that these principles were applied also beyond the manufacturing sector in a bunch of different sectors, and were pretty successful. So we can think that it's not just something completely driven by the manufacturing sector whose production is declining in Europe. And importantly, the magnitude of the results is comparable with modern setting, which seems to suggest that also not only the results, but also the magnitude of the results could to some extent be generalized outside the specific war setting. What are the policy implications? Well, management practices work in different firms and in different historical periods can be exported and adapted to different technologies. And I think that also another important lesson for policy evaluation that we can draw from economic history is the long-term impact. Sometimes programs are evaluated on a short time frame, and so some of the effects maybe did not fully materialize that. So taking a long-term perspective could also be informative about how long it takes for a program to be successful or their effect to persist, which of course could be important in a context of cost-benefit analysis. So I'm gonna stop here, more than happy to take any question, comments, or discuss about the implication of productivity, and thank you very much for coming today.